Thank you, and thanks to the organizers. I mean, I was actually here 2 years ago at the first pilot program, I guess, for this conference. And so this talk represents, I hope, some further thoughts about some of the things I was trying to say back then. So I really appreciate it. I want to thank the other speakers for really wonderful presentations. I'm a philosopher. I don't have a lab. I don't have any cool videos, but I do have some model organisms, which I can show you. There are my model organisms. They don't like it when I try to push them into different phases. But anyway. All right, so I've been thinking about deep neural nets. Everybody knows that they're remarkably successful, at least in some instances. They generalize well when trained on various data sets. They can predict 3D protein folding structures, et cetera. They do a lot of things, but there still remain a significant number of questions as to how they do all that. So we know that there are issues about overfitting, way too many parameters according to classical learning theory, et cetera. So a number of authors, and this I mentioned in the last time I was talking about this, have suggested or implied that one might explain some successes of deep neural nets, at least for some tasks, by arguing that they are implementing kind of renormalization group-like operations. And so what I would like to do is explore and go beyond some aspects of these suggestions. And so while I believe that claims of an exact mapping between deep neural nets and the renormalization group are pretty much overblown, it seems that certain deep neural nets can be understood as extracting relevant correlational information that's hidden in input data. And so here are a couple of reasons for thinking that there's at least some kind of connection between RG and DNNs. The renormalization group allows you to extract information concerning continuum scale behavior, like critical behavior of fluids, from all of the largely irrelevant gory details about the molecular makeup of the fluids. Deep neural nets apparently allow one to extract information relevant to classifying an image as that of a dog from all of the largely irrelevant gory details present in the pixels that make up the images. And so what I want to suggest is that these procedures are successful to the extent that they are, because there's genuine correlational information in those gory details in the input data. I think we can say something about the nature of that correlational information and where it comes from. I think that's important for understanding how these things do what they do. The correlations reflect the fact that the world exhibits various kinds of scale invariances. The correlations, and this is important for the mesoscale, multi-scale stuff that I'm kind of interested in, inhabit a scale between the micro level and the macro level. And so maybe that hierarchy there might help to explain some of the hierarchical nature of, or the depth of the deep neural nets. I don't have much to say about that, but we'll see. So I want to start with some natural images and some work done back in the 90s by Daniel Ruderman and William Bialik. They went and took a series of photographs in a state park near Princeton, New Jersey. The photos were primarily of trees, rocks, and a stream. They measured 256 by 256 pixels and corresponded to 15 degrees in visual angle. The data that they collected were the logarithm of each pixel's luminance. And the data showed scaling in the power spectrum of this form, where K is the spatial frequency, A is a constant representing the overall contrast power in the images. And for their data, the so-called anomalous exponent here, eta, had a value of 0.19. So I'm interested in how we can understand this power law scaling. And one way you could begin to understand it is by imagining forming blocks of pixels in analogy with block spin real space renormalization scheme developed by Leo Kadanoff. And we would see the same statistical structure in the pixel blocked images after appropriate renormalization. In fact, Ruderman and Bialik actually do this kind of pixel blocking. They plot the average contrast of the images normalized to unit variance, averaged over n by n pixel blocks for n equals 1 to all the way up to 32. Each such plot superposes on the same non-Gaussian distribution that collapses onto the same data, onto the same curve. Another indication of the robustness of the statistical structure in natural images is shown by implementing certain quite radical database recalibrations of the data. So if they change the grayscale images of the database to black and white, a new data set emerges which has virtually the same statistics. And here's what Ruderman says. He says that the process of geological formation of hillsides and valleys, or the structure of forests due to the succession of flora, can exhibit scaling through their images is perhaps not altogether surprising. It is striking, however, that the natural image data sets in which the scaling are found are all quite different. No two sets of pictures were even from the same environment. So that scaling result that I showed was a function of the spatial frequency. And Ruderman points out that working in the frequency domain is not the best way to understand the properties of natural images that are going to be responsible for the scaling that they discovered. In the Fourier frequency domain, objects are spread out and superposed over many different frequency bands. And so what Ruderman does is reformulates the results in the spatial domain. I'm skipping a bunch of very interesting mathematics here, but and introduces what he calls a pixel difference function that's going to allow him to define objects statistically. And this is important for my talk, that objects are going to be treated statistically. So we get this function here. It's a kind of expected variance. Pixels in different objects have a larger mean squared difference in luminance than those that belong to the same object. So expanding that square, Ruderman shows that it takes the form of this equation here. And the values for D1 and D2 are determined by randomly selecting 100,000 pixel point pairs from the images and tabulating their joint statistics. I guess that probably took a little bit longer than it would now with our computers, faster computers. And it turns out that yielded a value for eta of 0.19 in accordance with the anomalous dimension in the power spectrum. So what I'm interested in is how can this be explained? What is responsible for the form of that pixel difference function? Specifically, what explains the value of the scaling exponent eta? So here's a simple but important observation. Each point pair of pixels from an image can either belong to the same object or to two different objects. And so what we need to do is to determine the statistics, the probabilities that such point pairs are in the same object or not. Oh, I did it again. Okay. There we go. So what is responsible for the form of that pixel difference function? Specifically, what's responsible for explaining the value of the scaling exponent? And I already said this, so I'm reading. So we need to, all right. So another feature of import for natural images is that objects can occlude one another. So Ruderman constructed a nice simple model of image generation that allows for this occlusion and lets us identify statistically independent image components as distinct objects. And so the objects, as I said, are being defined statistically and not semantically. And I think that's important for understanding deep neural nets as we go on. So here's his model. Imagine walking on an infinite image plane. At a random location, you blindly select from a number of choices, an infinitesimally thin cardboard cutout of some shape. You paint it in a gray tone chosen from some distribution, and you drop it on the ground. This done, you move to another random location and repeat the process. So this is how we can build up images consisting of objects with the possibility that they occlude one another. And for this model, he shows that the correlation function is going to be this equation 3, where P sub same is the probability that a given point pair separated by a distance x belong to the same object. and C0 is the constant correlation within the objects. And the idea is that a power law in the correlation function means that there's going to be a power law in the spectrum. And to show that, we need to show that P same is itself a power law. And so this is how he goes about doing this. So he chose rectangular objects, start throwing a bunch of line segments on a plane which contains these rectangular objects. And what you want to know is what's the probability in configuration A that none of the endpoints of this line segment are in the object, the probability that at least one of the endpoints is in the object, and the probability that both endpoints are in the object. And if you do that, you get this nice little equation for P sub same in terms of those probability distributions. And he concludes that the scaling of inter-object probability follows directly from the scaling of apparent object sizes. In images of the real world, this apparent size in degrees depends on the object's actual size as well as its distance from the observer. So the overall distribution of apparent object size is thus a function of the distributions of object sizes and that of their distance. And note that we can find higher order correlations, endpoint correlation functions, by, instead of just throwing line segments of a certain length r, we can throw triangles to determine 3-point correlation functions. We can throw quadrilaterals to determine 4-point correlation functions. In effect, what we could do is try to reconstruct a field, right, using endpoint correlation functions. Now, Ruderman's scheme for determining the 2-point correlation functions between the pixels and the images is an instance of this widely applicable multi-scale methodology for understanding the behavior of many-body systems in condensed matter physics and in material science and elsewhere. So this methodology, something I wrote a book about that I talked about in the last time I was here, was promoted by Leo Kadanoff and Paul Martin in the 60s. It's sometimes referred to as a set of hydrodynamic or correlation function methods. In these many-body systems, some of the most important quantities that appear in the continuum systems, as most people here know, are so-called order parameters in the context of various transitions, and material parameters in the context of like thinking about continuum equations, like the Navier-Stokes equations for fluids or the Navier-Cauchy equations for materials. And examples of these kinds of parameters respectively include the net magnetization of a ferromagnet and the viscosity of a fluid. So what I argued was that values for these parameters are actually coding for these correlational structures at mesoscales in between the microscopic, the atomic or molecular scale, and the scale of the continuum, the scale of the entire system. And you can see this by noting that, for example, the net magnetization M for a ferromagnet is defined as the difference in the densities of upspins and downspins at spatiotemporal points. Right? So there's densities, the material and the order parameters are defined at these mesoscales. You just don't see densities at the scale of the atomic or the lattice. So the key takeaway is that the scaling structure in natural images is a function of certain correlations between the pixel values. The power law scale invariance in natural images is a function of that correlational information. As with many body systems, this information is discoverable at scales between that of the pixels and that of the entire image. It's also important that the scaling of inter-object probability is a function of the actual distribution of the object sizes and their distances. That's to say, I'm going to suggest that the effectiveness of deep neural nets in image recognition, at least, depends upon the existence of correlational information that reflects features of the real world. So there's a number of arguments by some philosophers, in particular my colleague Jim Woodward, about what's required in order to do sort of certain kinds of causal reasoning. He calls this project the sort of worldly infrastructure project of causation. Like, what does the world have to be like in order to be able to perform certain kind of manipulationist investigations into causal relations? I want to suggest that this is a kind of worldly infrastructure project for deep neural nets, in that one of the reasons that they work is that there actually are these certain kinds of robust correlational features in our world. And if those features weren't there, these things wouldn't be working. Okay, so let me move on. So in an influential paper by Lin, Tegmark, and Rolnick that was entitled, "Why Does Deep and Cheap Learning Work So Well?" they aim to show how the success of deep learning depends not only on the mathematics of neural networks, but also on certain facts about the world, fitting with this kind of infrastructure project. And they raise this puzzle. How can neural networks approximate functions well in practice when the set of possible functions is exponentially larger than the set of practically possible networks? That question arises because, as most people here I'm sure know, even networks with only one hidden layer can be universal function approximators. So if you're given a sufficient number of hidden units, any smooth function can be approximated to any accuracy with just a single hidden layer. And they give a kind of quick, pretty much well-known estimate that demonstrates that networks of feasible size just can't do this. There are 2 to the n different Boolean functions of n variables, they say. So a network implementing a generic function in this class requires at least 2 to the n bits to describe. That is, more bits than there are atoms in the universe if n is greater than 260. So the space of functions is enormous. Despite this, neural networks of feasible size, where by that you should read actually implementable, have been extremely successful. And so they argue in this paper that for physics reasons, physicists typically only care about a very small subset of the space of possible functions. They say those functions, they say, are Hamiltonians, so how they talk, that have a low polynomial order, exhibit certain symmetries, and involve local interactions primarily. The kind of functions that we want to approximate are therefore far from being just any old function in the class of all functions. They're far from being random. In effect, these guys argue that one of the reasons DNNs work well is because the space of functions that we actually care about is extremely small in the space of all functions. So I think there's something right about this, but it's not much of an explanation, right? I mean, our interests can and should only be part of the reason deep neural nets work. Not all deep learning is aimed at problems in physics. I don't know what it is, what the Hamiltonian is for the image of a dog, for example. So of real interest is how the deep neural nets actually find the functions that work, right? The functions that correctly recognize objects at the scale of dogs, given inputs at the scale of pixels. So the explanation for this has to appeal to actual facts about the world, facts about the scale invariances, and to the means by which deep neural nets find functions that detect the correlations that yield those scale invariances. So, as we've seen, it's well known that training deep neural nets takes place using a variety of data sets. In the context of image recognition, we've seen some of these this morning. There are a bunch of data sets. There's MNIST, which is a large database of handwritten numbers. FMNIST, which is an MNIST-like database of labeled fashion images. CIFAR, which is a very large database. CIFAR 10, which is a very large database of labeled images from 10 classes that represent airplanes, birds, cars, deer, dogs, frogs, horses, ships, and trucks. And ImageNet, which is a huge database containing more than 14 million labeled images from more than 20,000 classes or categories, and lots of other data sets. It's interesting to me that a bunch of these kinds of images are not natural, not like trees or rocks and streams, right? Rather, they are things like chairs and trucks and other artifacts that have been constructed. There have been empirical studies of the statistics of these data sets using the theory of random matrices. These studies involve the study of the eigenvalue spectra of matrices that represent samples from the data sets. That is, they look at so-called empirical covariance matrices or Gram matrices, where the matrices are members of this R to the D cross M, where D is the dimension of the image vectors and M is the number of samples. Empirical investigation shows that the bulk of the eigenvalues for various data sets represent, quote, the correlational structure of different features amongst themselves, and that these decay as a particular kind of power law. And in this context, Levy and Oz actually refers explicitly to Ruderman's scaling law that he discovered in the 90s. So remarkably, the various data sets mentioned earlier all exhibit the same power law behavior. And so you can see this in these scree plots. These are a bunch of different data sets. This horizontal line here, the pink line, is uncorrelated Gaussian data. And there are these facts here about the values of the scaling exponents alpha. So the fact that images of the world present with certain statistical structure, I think, is critical to understanding how deep neural nets are actually able to generalize. And so what I want to do now is present some results of some empirical studies on actual deep neural nets that have been trained on various data sets. And so I'm actually looking at this paper. It's on the archive, entitled Implicit Self-Regulation in Deep Neural Networks, Evidence from Random Matrix Theory and Implications for Learning by Martin and Mahoney. So they give evidence that the empirical spectral densities of the correlation matrices exhibit statistics from a random matrix theory universality class of heavy-tailed distributions. And those heavy-tailed distributions, power law distributions, are often the mark of that you're dealing with complex systems. They represent the energy landscape or the optimization function of a typical DNN having layer L layers with activation functions HL, weight matrices per layer WL, and biases B as given in this little schema here. They study the weight matrices for the various layers before, during, and after training on various databases and for a wide range of actual deep neural nets. Specifically, they analyze the empirical spectral density of the correlation matrix associated with a layer weight matrix W for various layers, typically the higher layers in the network. So random matrix theory is a kind of cool set of mathematics that I studied a long time ago a little bit because it was being used to describe differences between quantum mechanical systems whose classical counterparts were integrable on the one hand or chaotic on the other, and there were different sort of statistics there. But here, the main thing to note is, and I'm sure everybody here knows this, is that it kind of provides laws of large number-like and central limit-like results for matrices. It yields unique results for both square and rectangular matrices. But in state-of-the-art deep neural nets, square matrices are relatively rare because their number of parameters is typically greater than the number of examples that one looks at. Now, a lot of work in random matrix theory, at least in the beginning, focused on a class of matrices that are members of the universality class of Gaussian distributions. Correlation matrices in that Gaussian class have a spectral density functions that look like this here. And in the limit, as n goes to infinity, with keeping the aspect ratio n over m fixed, takes the form of so-called Marchenko-Pasteur distribution, which we have here. And so here are some Marchenko-Pasteur distributions for these spectral densities. On the left, we have different aspect ratios, n over m, with fixed variances, and at the right, we fix the different aspect ratios, and we have different variances. So in effect, these kinds of plots are the random matrix theory equivalent or analogs of Gaussian or normal distributions in ordinary probability theory, right? Now, Martin and Mahoney empirically investigate the statistics of weight matrices for fully connected layers and a number of trained state-of-the-art deep neural nets. I guess I said that already. But what they observe are, quote, profound deviations from traditional Marchenko-Pasteur-based random matrix theory. And they find that these deep neural nets are reminiscent of strongly correlated disordered systems that exhibit heavy-tailed behavior. So most importantly, they argue that the training process for these deep neural nets, in a certain sense, itself engineers a form of self-regularization into the trained model. No need for, any kind of regression, any kind of lasso regression or ridge regression or anything like that. So this is kind of what their studies demonstrate. They see a taxonomy of various trained models. The one up here has a pretty good Marchenko-Pasteur fit, related to sort of Gaussian kind of distributions. And then as things get trained via backpropagation, stochastic gradient descent, the MP fit gets worse and worse and worse until at some point you start to see heavy-tailed distributions. So this is sort of what I just said. The figure exhibits the evolution of the statistics of the empirical spectral densities of the correlation matrices associated with a specific weight layer matrix. The empirical spectral densities evolve under training using stochastic gradient descent from random-like distributions with good Marchenko-Pasteur fit that are associated sort of with the random initialization of the deep neural nets at the start of training, and they evolve to heavy-tailed distributions that correspond to strong correlations in these weight matrices at the end of training. So the idea is that one can model these empirical spectral densities of trained deep neural nets with heavy-tailed distributions using random matrix theory. So they note that for deep neural nets, these correlations arise in the weight matrices during backprop training, at least when training on data of reasonable quality. That is, the weight matrices in effect learn the correlations of the data. The later weight matrices actually take on the same statistical distributions of the data sets, the power law statistics of the data sets that they're being trained on. So that, if true, and given the robust statistical power law behavior of the various data sets, might help us explain at least some of the remarkable success of deep neural nets. So that's my suggestion. So I'm going to conclude, but it's a rather long conclusion, so it'll take me a little while. So what I hope to have motivated the idea that the success of deep neural nets at certain tasks can be understood in terms of their ability to discover correlational structures that are present in the real-world data. It's remarkable, at least to me, that the various data sets used to train these things all exhibit scaling behavior similar to one another and similar to the behavior that Ruderman found in the investigations of images in the woods that we started with. And of course, one way to think about this is an analogy with the universal behavior of critical phenomena, right? So here's a famous picture from Guggenheim. We've got a bunch of different fluids. When they're near their critical points and you plot their critical temperatures versus their critical densities, In reduced coordinates, they all collapse onto the same curve, exhibiting kind of the universality that we all know and love. So just as in this figure from Guggenheim, the different data sets upon which the DNNs get trained all exhibit the same scaling law behavior. That's what was discovered using random matrix theory. And that's true despite the fact that they have widely varying and wildly differing details at the fundamental pixel scale levels. That is, despite being data sets of very, very different images. Similar, but the fluids that were plotted on that graph all have different molecular, different molecules, different interaction strengths between the molecules, et cetera. Nevertheless, when one looks at the continuum scales, they exhibit the same behavior near criticality. So a lot of the literature on deep neural nets, specifically convolutional neural nets, focuses on their ability to serve as feature detectors. Features that are apparently present in the images that they receive as input. Not again. So we've heard this in some talks here, and this is quite often talked about, and philosophers have somehow latched onto this in a big way. They said that the convolutional neural nets are said to detect low-level features like edges at early levels in the architecture during training, and then in deeper layers, they supposedly managed to combine these lower-level features into more abstract features that enable them to recognize or learn that certain images are images, for example, of dogs. Now, I think that this talk of feature detection is somewhat misleading in that it seems to imply that deep neural networks are sort of recognizing certain aspects of semantic categories, maybe in the way that we humans do. But remember that Ruderman's analysis explicitly avoided a semantic understanding of objects in the images. So rather than identifying objects in images semantically, as the term feature detection kind of suggests, Ruderman argued, prior to deep neural nets anyway, that we should think of objects as being statistically defined. And in doing that, he was led to determine the probabilities that two pixels separated by some angular distance x belong to the same object. As he says, the notion of statistically correlated and uncorrelated regions within the images corresponding to objects provides a simple, robust path to scale invariance as long as those objects appear in all sizes according to a power law distribution. His conclusion, which I read before, but I'll read again, was that the scaling of inter-object probability follows directly from the scaling of apparent object sizes. In images of the real world, this apparent size in degrees depends upon an object's actual size as well as its distance from the observer. The overall distribution of apparent object size is thus a function of the distributions of object sizes and that of their distances. So real-world mesoscale structure determines the correlational structure among the pixels in the images. And that's what ultimately allows the deep neural nets to correctly characterize their images. Now, Ruderman demonstrated, as we saw, that one can determine the image scaling laws by constructing or finding two-point correlation functions. That's not a lot of information, but it's enough to get you the power law, the exponent in the power law. But surely is not sufficient for deciding whether an image is an image of a dog or not. So here's my, being a philosopher and not a mathematician or a physicist, I'm conjecturing that higher order endpoint correlation functions are required in order to perform this kind of image recognition. And I would love to have somebody tell me how to figure out whether that's actually what's going on. So it's here. So if we can think of deep neural nets as finding higher order endpoint correlation functions, then maybe we can get a decent explanation of how it is that they're able to recognize various kinds of objects, because they've learned a heck of a lot of correlational information that's hidden in the initial input pixel data. And it's here that invoking a strong analogy between the renormalization group and deep neural nets might be fruitful. So a paper by Maida and Schwab in 2014, a very deeply cited paper, suggests that there is an exact mapping between renormalization group and deep learning based on stacked restricted Boltzmann machines, which essentially is what we have here in some of these deep neural nets. So here's a figure from their paper. It's a figure of a one-dimensional Ising chain, spins on a line with fixed spacing between them, with couplings between the neighboring spins denoted by J. If we decimate, kill off every other spin, that kind of yields a sort of crude coarse graining, analogous to the block spin formation that I mentioned earlier, that Kadanoff yielded. It's crude because we're not taking a kind of majority rule, we're just killing off half of our legionnaires. And as before, there arise new couplings between the remaining spins, right? So now we have these kind of new couplings, Ji's, between the remaining spins. So this other figure is a sort of deep neural net analog. And in this figure, the J superscript i's are what called hidden spins by Maida and Schwab. And they code for correlations between the spins or the neuron weights in the previous layer of the neural network. So I suggest that one way that we think of the blocking / decimation of the renormalization group scheme, as in some sense sort of actively creating block spins, thereby eliminating microscopic degrees of freedom that are irrelevant for the upper continuum scale behavior that we actually care about, namely like the scaling that takes place near criticality. The deep neural nets, on the other hand, kind of passively reveals correlations that are hidden in the microscopic details, but only emerge or become visible at higher scales. And so my suggestion, again, which I'd like help in finding out whether this is a good suggestion, is that the higher layers in deep neural nets can be seen as revealing or finding these 3-point, 4-point endpoint correlation functions that are present in the pixelated input. Right? I mean, if I'm interested in determining the value for the viscosity of a fluid, theoretically, I don't start with I'm going to fail utterly if I'm trying to come up with a theoretical value for the viscosity, say, for water. I'm going to fail dramatically if I just take a look at the interactions between the molecules at the scale and the dynamics at that scale. If I look at correlational structures at mesoscales and try to find 1-point, 2-point, 1-point correlations will give me volume fractions. I mean, imagine I have imagine this also happens in material science. So imagine I have a composite material that's composed of an insulator and a conductor, say. If I want to know what the conductivity of the material as a whole at the continuum scale is, then I can actually try to figure out what that is by throwing darts at this thing and asking what's the relative frequency that my dart is going to land in the conducting phase as opposed to the insulating phase. That's going to give me a 1-point correlation, and that's going to tell me what the volume fractions are, right? But if I really want to know, so if this is the insulating phase, and this matrix phase is the conductor, and I try to just upscale using that information, that volume fraction information, I'm going to grossly get my conductivity wrong, right? I need to know that the conducting phase is topologically connected as opposed to the inclusion phase, right? And so this is going to be a much better conductor, even if this was a 50-50 mixture. Then, so that's the idea. So I want to determine a value for the conductivity of this material. I can sort of theoretically start at mesoscales and try to reconstruct the field that'll give me since the material parameter is a field, is a function of the reals, it's going to give me this, I'm going to be able to determine that theoretical value by starting at mesoscales and looking at these correlation functions. So if I'm right about that, then it does seem that DNNs are in effect reconstructing this continuum level field that is the image of the dog, or at least that's the analogy that I'd like to try to make. And so finally, one last point, there's evidence that deep neural nets that have been trained on one particular data set require considerably less training to become successful image classifiers on data sets that they've not seen before. Why, right? I mean, after all, the images are very different. So we have the MNIST images of handwritten numerals, and then go to the fashion models, they don't look anything the same, right? Well, the answer possibly is because they've already achieved a kind of alignment with the ground truth function. Read the robust power scaling law that's common between all the data sets, right? So it shouldn't really be a surprise that the deep neural nets port well to other data sets. They still, of course, require training on these because they're trying to recognize different images, but they've already got the sort of statistics, the statistical weight parameter structure has already been learned. The 2-point correlation functions has already been learned. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.